as promised, a discussion of survey research interview methods inside, I hope, a context that's focused on contemporary problems with survey research enterprise. You can call it an industry. See, I have here, I'm going to talk about each one of these cells going down this way for note-taking purposes. I'll tell you what these, I have abbreviations, I want to tell you what they mean so you can get them in your notes. These are the methods. PI stands for personal interviewing. This is the old trusty United States Postal Service. Mail surveys, physical, not email. TL is for telephone survey, and this is net. Internet surveys can take a variety of forms. They can arrive via email and take you to a different link. I'm going to talk about then on the X, actually the Y axis, issues related to cost, cost effectiveness, response rate, hugely important these days. Interviewer control, what I mean by that is the extent to which the person conducting the interview, if there is a person conducting the interview, has control over the situation and can recognize, for example, in personal interviewing, can recognize a problem of understanding related to a question and improvise a little bit, so I'm saying on the telephone, or a language issue. Increasingly, in the United States, we have people who speak their first language is not English, so this is important. And last, and this is all abbreviated, so this is a population list accuracy. Population list accuracy, and what I mean by that is in order to sample from the population, you need a list of the items or the units in the population of interest. And again, there's going to be variability here across these. First thing I want to talk about is personal interviewing, and I'll call it the gold standard. And look down, this is a negative, when high here is negative, high here on the rest of these is positive. Personal interviewing is the gold standard. The response rate, high. Now, the response rate is high in part because the cost is high. The cost for a national survey of, say, 1,000 people, the interviewers actually arrive in person to the person's home or wherever, arrange a meeting somewhere, so forth. These are horrendously expensive. So high is not really high here, it's astronomical. And almost every mode of communication with a potential respondent in a survey project is used when a personal interview is to be arranged. As you contact them by mail, you contact them, try to by telephone, you contact them if you can via email, however you can. Once you've selected a household and selected then a potential respondent inside the household, you do also personal interviewing is high on a lot of these dimensions because given the cost is astronomical already, often respondents are given some incentive to participate. That can be true across all of the interview methods, but it's really typical in personal interviewing because it's already going to cost an outrageous amount of money. Response rates are high. People will still meet in person, especially, again, if they've been called, written, it's a respected, known name or operation, a university, especially a prominent university. And so you're going to do this. It's very unlikely where I am right now that anybody would be selected to participate in a national survey. But if true probability sampling methods were used, then it's possible that one of my neighbors, people who live here full time, one of my neighbors could be selected for a personal interview, and they'd be contacted. The group doing this, spending a lot of money contacting them in advance to arrange a time to interview, and properly compensated and maybe not even compensated. Typically, if there's trust established, respondents will go through with it. So you get high there on response rate because there's so much money involved. High on interviewer control, highest on interviewer control of all of them. You have an interviewer typically trained a lot, since you're going to spend a lot of money. You don't want to send rookies into the field. A trained interviewer, now you can recognize immediately if a translator is needed, and even recognize maybe if they're experienced and trained, when a respondent may not have understood the question as the question was intended to be answered. So it'll use a little bit of improvisation there to get higher quality answers. The population list accuracy, again, is largely because the United States Census and the combination of the census and the United States mail, you can put together lists pretty easily. If you use ordinarily, it's a very complex probability sampling design that would start with some aggregated unit. I had mentioned congressional district, randomly sampling within those and then getting down to the nitty-gritty. But abodes are still pretty good. Now, you're going to miss people who are homeless. You're going to miss people who are in the course of moving. You're going to miss certain populations and have to account for that. But again, if I gave you the address, the physical United States mailing address of the home where I'm making these videos, you could plug that into Google Maps and actually look at the front of the house. So these are physical addresses are really good. So if you go to the United States Mail, the cost here relative to personal interviewing is not moderate. It's really low. Just in the context of all of them, mail survey costs are moderate, although I should note that they continue to rise, as you probably know. Printing costs are substantial, and in addition, just if you send anything less than first-class mail, it's going to be totally ignored. So the first-class mail costs have to be factored in. Low here is pathetically low, and you know it. You know it without me saying it. If you get a letter in the mail and someone wants you to fill out a survey, put it back in an envelope, even if it's got the stamp, of course it would. Chances of you filling it out are really, really low. Mail survey response rates. There are a number of ways, whole books have been written on how sort of graphically to present mail surveys to increase the response rates, but we're talking about increasing them from virtually non-existent to some really low one-digit percentage number. This is a horrid on response rates. Horrid on interviewer control, you have none. So even if you have someone filling out your mail survey, you have no guarantees that they're understanding the questions. You have no sense of their literacy. You have no sense of whether English is the first language. Have very little or no control here. But once again, the population list accuracy can be relative to everything else, despite problems, people moving, not having a mailing address. Despite all those problems relative to the others, the population list accuracy for mail survey is high. I'm going to spend a little more time here than elsewhere because it's a very current topic in the area of survey research methods. The cost is fairly moderate to do a telephone survey. We kind of have in the 1980s. Catchphrase, which is really an acronym, CATI, which stands for Computer Assisted Telephone Interviewing, comes into the mainstream, and by the 1990s, anybody who's doing telephone survey research is doing it using a computer and a person. So the computer's doing all the work, dialing the phone, categorizing telephone numbers instantly if there is no real number there, and so forth. And the interviewer here does virtually nothing except read the question and record the answer, again, on a computer. So you can pay really low wages for, not recommending any of you set up a sweatshop or anything, but you can pay low wages. What you're looking for here is somebody who has a good voice and can read well and follow follow instructions, and you pay hourly wages and collect a lot of data, paying one person a small wage. So the costs are moderate. Response rate, I mentioned this in the lead-in, response rates in telephone survey research are now they're now sort of pathetic. So this like changes every year. It began to be bad in the 1990s, but it got horrible in this century. And today, response rates on telephone surveys are disastrously low. So low that the idea of the probability sample has done great damage. And essentially the telephone survey industry now is involved in quota sampling post hoc. So they get what they get from what would have been a probability sample, have very low response rates, and they take the data and then weight it. Weight responses, for example, if they're low on responses from women, they weight responses from women higher in figuring out the statistics we want to make inferences about, and so forth. The story is a simple one. In the 1980s, people answered the wired telephone, wired telephone to the household. Those penetration rates in some parts of the country were way into the 90s. Not in Mississippi ever, but penetration rates were way into the 90s, so everybody had a phone, everybody answered it. And then came the technology, the early technology of answering machines, and the tendency of people to not move instantly when the phone rang, and let the answering machine serve as sort of a screener. And then after that, you have caller ID in the window, and you see that it's not your friend calling or your mom calling, and moreover, you can see maybe the number's blocked, and you know this is someone you don't want to talk to. So this is happening in the 90s, and they're plummeting, and then comes the cell phone, and sort of would become a very different etiquette with the telephone, given cell versus the wired phone in the home, which once upon a time, not answering the phone was rather like not answering the door when someone came to visit. And you all have your own telephone habits, and you know that if you're called, you want to see in the window someone you know. And if you don't see someone you know, not only are you not going to probably answer it, but you're probably going to get irritated that your phone has been called. And there are also laws protecting cell phone owners from telemarketing, and telemarketers sort of ruined the game of survey research by telephone, because people associate survey researchers incorrectly with telemarketers, people having something to sell. So low, pathetically low, crashing the industry, where the industry intends to make an inference from sample to population. There's sort of a crash going on at the level of the telephone. Interviewer control, moderate, you can't see the respondent, and yet you can hear and know if you have a language problem. And sometimes with a sort of a stuttering response, the interviewer can recognize maybe there was a problem and then read the question again. This is more control than you have with mail surveys, and more control than you have with internet surveys, so we'll call that moderate. The population list accuracy used to be really good, so it used to be spectacular. In the 1980s, with 90+% penetration of wired telephones into abodes, individual households, you had really good population list accuracy by using the first, so it's a 662 is my area code, and 236, and this is my phone, first digit's my phone number, and everything was arranged geographically in this wonderful way. So you could take a phone book and look and find all the exchanges that were associated with a town, and say it's the town that you've selected at random, and then you need to randomly select within the town people to call. The exchanges were fixed, and when I moved to Oxford, there were only two, 234 and 236, and those easy to gather, and the population list actually thus was very high. All this is over. Incidentally, you fill in these two here with a process called random digit dialing, RDD. Random digit dialing is still the gold standard in telephone survey research. It's just that now you don't select just these two digits. You have a lot of computing power put to the task of selecting most everything at random. And yet, as we move to population list accuracy, you have this problem, especially in political surveys where you hope to extract some political information. Politics is all local. Geography is critical. And if you were all here in the classroom with me and I asked you, and I will ask you to raise your hands, relative to the question now, do you have a wired telephone? The answer is going to be generally no, and so none of this matters anymore. And then I ask you, do you have a cell phone? The answer is going to be uniformly yes. So cell phone penetration is sort of replacing what we had in the 1980s with wired penetration, but there's a problem. The geography problem, many of you don't have even area code 662. So even though you live in Oxford, Mississippi right now, you are using a phone that came from home, and you likely always will. So you can move to California, and this phone number is probably going to follow you when you're finished. So telephone survey researchers increasingly are including so-called samples of cell phone only users. And the best researchers are, but this is a very difficult enterprise, and it's far less scientific than it is, in a sense, artistic, because you have to do the random digit dialing, and then once you have someone on the phone, you don't know where they are. And one of the first questions you want to know is where they are and where they live, and that gets instantly to the sensitive questions, and there you get a lot of hang-ups. So this is a disaster now, population list accuracy, and becoming more and more so in a generational way. The generational divide is interesting in politics. It's interesting for us because I've mentioned this, or I will, hard to remember, the organization of the videos, but if I haven't mentioned this already, I will. It's a really interesting time to study politics and generations, because your generation is fundamentally different on, especially a lot of social issues, than generations before in advance of you. In 2008, voters between 18 and 30 cut more than 2 to 1 for candidate Obama, and a good portion of that divide persisted to the 2012 through the 2012 election. And this is really, really important. Now, voters who are young don't vote as frequently as voters who are older, but those voters who are young are getting older as we speak. And it's this important generational divide that's critical for political scientists to understand. And it's complicated to study because these two generations, the older generation, I still have a wired phone in my home. I don't know why. I never answer it. But old people like myself still have wired telephones and cell phones, and your generation is cell phone only, and hard to contact and hard to pin down in terms of where they live. So people believe the future of survey research is over here, using some sort of internet technology, and I agree sort of mechanically. But again, we go to the population list accuracy, and want to sort of contact me probabilistically in a known way, or can contact you probabilistically in a known way. And you want to do it using the internet. Well, how do you do it? Do you contact me using my email address? And my second question is, which one? Or do you contact me, and do I count in the population list via Facebook? Facebook publishes, almost whether you want to or not, publishes a sort of email. I don't know what the Facebook private message is. It's kind of a lousy implementation, in my opinion, of email. But there's an idea. Where we live on the net, put simply, is just not clear. And because where we live on the net is not clear, the problem of doing probability samples becomes ridiculously hard, independent of the fact that the response rates are going to typically be absurdly, sometimes obscenely low. Probably not a day goes by when you're not in some way, shape, or form contacted, sometimes subtly, and asked to do an internet survey. It could be off on the right-hand side of your Facebook page. Could be anywhere, and yet, from the standpoint of probability sampling, all these issues are incredibly complex. The cost of internet surveys is the great draw toward the future, because it's possible for them to be free if you already have infrastructure that you use for other purposes. Using that infrastructure to conduct an internet survey is ridiculously simple. At Ole Miss and many other universities, there's a really easy to use tool for crafting internet-based surveys called Qualtrics, and you might want to use it sometime while you're here. It costs money if you're not in the university environment. Ole Miss has a site license for Qualtrics. Outside, SurveyMonkey is a very popular site for building internet-based surveys. And if your population is discrete, internet surveys can be really, really handy. I'm thinking right off the top of my head, so if you have like a 350 person sorority on campus, with 350 members, and you want to know what people in your sorority or fraternity think on a given topic, why don't you send all of them and get their email addresses and send all of them an email and ask them to hit the link and go do the survey on Qualtrics. So you know they're not all going to do it. you know they're not all going to do it. It might be easier to take a random sample of them and send a smaller sample, say 50, a random sample, and send it to those 50 and then continue to follow up. Following up with 350 can be difficult, but follow up in a personal way. So these things internet surveys in some circumstances can be handy. Where they go from here is really anybody's guess, though, because we don't have internet homes. Our email addresses aren't our homes. Our Facebooks aren't our homes. Our Instagram, that's not our home. All of those things somehow put together are our homes, and some of us do all of those things, and Twitter and everything else, and some of us don't. So, also, internet is excluding a large population. Increasingly, older adults are getting on the internet and are getting on social media, but you already know that there's a great divide between the sort of availability online of people relative to their age. Can I think of a gold standard? I can, and increasingly this is happening. It's very, very costly, but if I'm going to lay out a hypothetical scenario of how to get a good sample and then entice the people in the sample to respond, and I'm going to spend a lot of money, a ton of money, and so I'm going to use them as my sample over and over again. So let's say I find through some sort of complex scheme that involves a probability sample, I identify 1,000 individuals in the United States, and I come to them with the following proposition. I'm going to give you an iPhone 5, the new one that's coming out in September of 2013. I'm going to give you an iPhone 5. I'm going to pay your all your minutes, talk as much as you want, use it, text, everything's free for a whole year, and in return, you're going to have to, over the course of the presidential election, you're going to have to, on the phone, fill out surveys and also respond on the phone to surveys. People will do this. The problem is that 1,000 times 600 is 600,000. Really, really good survey research is going to become astronomically expensive because of all the changes in technology. And it's always, really, really good survey research has always been expensive, the gold standard being the personal interview. But a new gold standard is going to have to emerge because this is obscenely expensive, and sort of move from ridiculously expensive. We're going to have to involve enticements, I think, with enabling people who don't have technology and encouraging those even who do. So all of you have a phone. Probably none of us would turn down the offer of a completely free year with an iPhone 5 if all we had to do was respond to surveys every now and again. And that could create nice panel data. So I think this is where things are heading. Most of the major commercial pollsters these days are producing less reliable information than they have really in my adult lifetime due to the changes that have been documented over here. I'm going to do one more, I promise, shorter. Do one more item on survey research, which means we'll have to take a week in class, so I'll have to figure that out. It's going to be about questionnaire design, question wording, question order, and other effects that can, other things about sort of building the survey research enterprise that can have material effects on the results. More.